This is an experiment I carried out in Melbourne at the Telecommunications Research Laboratories, where they test the effects of lightning on various materials and equipment. The scientist there, Ed Bondarenko, although he'd retired, he still had access to his laboratory, and so I was able to arrange for him to do some experiments for us to demonstrate some of the things that happen in space. What we have here is a normal drink can. The top has been removed. That's only to stop it from exploding. Here, this red enclosed object is a coil of just a few turns of very heavy copper pipe, and it's connected to an electrode here. Underneath you can just see the insulators, and there's a heavy-duty capacitor that it stores an awful lot of electricity in that. So when this circuit is closed here, the current flows through the coil. This can experiences a powerful magnetic field, and you can see what happens. Unfortunately, there was just a little noise from my computer, but it was deafening. And this is the result. That's called an electromagnetic pinch. I can run that again. And you see this is very hot too. I had to sort of toss it around a bit until it cooled. So an electromagnetic pinch is very good at gathering any conducting plasma, because remember the metal in this case takes the place of a plasma, constrict it and twist it. This is exactly what happens to form a spiral galaxy. And this is from one of the textbooks on plasma cosmology. And it shows the formation of spiral galaxy, because that's one of the big questions. How or why is it that when you look into the sky, most of the galaxies you see are this beautiful spiral shape? Gravity can't explain that. What happens is you have these Birkeland current filaments in space. Although they're coloured here, they're invisible at this stage. And this is sort of a cross-section through the two with the magnetic field arrangement. At 20 million years, two current filaments are drawn close together because the current is flowing in the same direction. And when you have the current flowing in two wires in the same direction, they are drawn together. And the force is a 1 over r force, for those who know their physics, instead of a 1 over r squared force, which means that it gathers material over a much greater volume than gravity ever could. Now, because of the difference in mass of a proton and an electron, the result is that the two move slightly differently, and the result is a twisting action. So the two come together and start twisting. That's these green areas, just to give you an example. And this happens at about 100 million years. At 120 million years, not only are they twisting around one another, but they're beginning to form a tadpole shape, like this. And at 500 million years, the complete spiral is visible. Now, these are computer simulations of what happens. And that's the electromagnetic pinch effect in deep space. And it forms spiral galaxies naturally. It doesn't require dark matter, black holes, or anything. It's just electrical engineering. So plasma experiments show that the spiral form is a natural result when two cosmic Birkeland currents intersect. A spiral galaxy is the grandest visible form of plasma discharge in the universe. And that's a completely new way of looking at things. This is just a bit of extra information. I won't dwell on it. It gives you the geometry and the dimensions of the Birkeland currents and so on. But this is the computer simulation. You start here, they gradually begin to twist, they begin to form this tadpole shape, and then they form the grand spiral arms. The simulations don't show you that there is a matter sump at the centre, which is the coolest spot, and that forms the galaxy bulge. And this gives you an idea of the currents involved. The average galactic Birkeland current is 10 to the 19 amps. That's 10 with 19 zeros after. And it's also called after Alfvén, the galactic current, and the radiated synchrotron power is 10 to the 37 watts. It's mind-boggling. when you get this electromagnetic pinch in deep space, it takes on a particular form. This has been observed in that Z-pinch machine that I mentioned before. The Z-pinch refers to the fact that the experiment is carried out with the can and the discharge taking place in the vertical direction, which is the Z-axis, if you like. Being an American machine, they call it a Z-pinch. And this is the complex form that the particles move in inside that Z-pinch. It is a filamentation instability, it's called. So you get these beams in a ring, concentric rings, and then the main central current column was down here, that purple bit there. It has the unique property of producing concentration of matter. So this is what happens in stars by a process called Markland convection, named after the guy who figured out that the heavy elements would sink to the centre. Now, this is interesting in relation to stars. When you form a star, what do you find on the outermost atmosphere? Hydrogen and helium. The electric sun, because, as I said earlier, stars are formed in this plasma pinch, electromagnetic pinch. The result of that is that the core is made up of heavy elements. So it can be a solid or a liquid body. Out here is the photosphere, and that is purely an electrical discharge phenomenon, familiar to those who work on arc lighting and that kind of thing. And then beyond that is the chromosphere, and beyond that is the corona, this white area. Now, of course, the puzzle has always been that the further you get from this photosphere, the hotter it gets. It's 5,000 degrees here, roughly, 10,000 degrees here, 1,000,000 degrees here, and 20 million out here. Well, what fireplace do you know gets hotter the further away you get from it? Now, this has been a huge puzzle for astrophysicists, but they've invented all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas as to how you get the energy from here out to there without affecting here. Okay, so this is an electric star. It has a core which would look like a giant planet if you could strip all this atmosphere and electrical activity away. And that's important because the Proto-Saturnian model says that Saturn was, until recently, a dwarf star. The electric discharge becomes strongest close to the sun, heating the thin atmosphere to 1,000,000 degrees or more. And the superheated corona is a familiar glow discharge phenomenon recognised by high voltage engineers. In fact, you get a corona discharge from those high voltage transmission lines under favourable weather conditions. Now we generalise this and say, okay, if this is the picture for the sun, what about these red giants and white dwarfs and all these kind of things? All stars are lit like the lights of a great city at night. They're lit at great distances from where their power is being generated. If anyone's flown over Las Vegas at night, it's lit up like a Christmas tree, but all of the power comes from hundreds of miles away from the Hoover Dam. In the same way, a galaxy is getting its power from intergalactic space, and the stars participate in that because they're part of the circuit. And because the star acts as a focus, you have a Z-pinch effect in the current stream. And this has only recently been discovered by satellites and deep spacecraft that have found energetic neutral atoms, they call them, coming from outside the solar system, and they're absolutely astounded. They're coming from a ring around the sun. And remember I said the Z-pinch is a cylindrical discharge? What they're seeing is the solar wind going out to this cylinder, interacting just like that supernova with those filaments and being projected back into the solar system. Giants and dwarfs. The usual story is that stars consume their fuel. In other words, they self-immolate. They consume their own body, and in the process they change. And that change can be to giants or dwarfs, depending on the size of the original star. The story is incredibly complicated, and they continually find anomalies when they look closely at certain kinds of stars. What's more, the story is complex and it's unverifiable. because what they're talking about are things that are happening inside a star, and you cannot see what's happening inside a star. Red giants are huge only because their glowing anode sheaths, in other words their atmosphere, which is electrified, has swollen. It's grown bigger because it's not collecting enough current from the surroundings, and to do that it increases the size of its anode. It's increasing its surface area in space. Plasma has an almost lifelike ability to adjust to its surroundings.
I just thought I'd show this. It's rare.
So this is a picture of the various star types. You have a red dwarf, main sequence, blue giant, white dwarf, red giant. A red dwarf is a small star. In fact, the centre of this star is probably no bigger than Jupiter, or maybe a couple of Jupiters in size.
It gets better.
The other type of red star is the red giant below, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you'll notice I've drawn them the same. And the reason for that is it's essentially the same mechanism. They're the same kind of star. And red dwarfs are not really dwarfs. They're only called dwarfs because by the theory says they should be. A main sequence star, like our own sun, has what's called tufted anode effects, which gives you the photosphere and gives you that granulation. It's a controlled discharge. It's one that has a transistor effect. That layer adjusts to keep the heat and light output fairly constant, even while the power input changes. A blue giant is a large star under high electrical stress. It's like having an arc light you turn the power up on an arc light and it goes from white to blue-white. The spectrum shifts. And a red giant, the normal star under low electrical stress, develops a bloated glowing plasma sheath. And the white dwarf is a normal star in direct contact with the space plasma and has low luminosity. Recently it was discovered that jets were emitting from a brown dwarf, but they're supposed to be low energy failed stars. In other words, there was not sufficient energy in them to drive such a thing. However, astronomers found jets coming out from the 24 Jupiter mass brown dwarf. This is an artist's rendition. The jets stretch about 1 billion kilometres and the material is rushing away from the brown dwarf with a speed of a few kilometres a second. The jets and the expulsion disk fit the electric Z-pinch model of stars. In other words, the jets and the disk are all explicable in terms of the electrical model of formation of stars.
Do that. So, let's see. So are you saying that the whole thing we've been doing with astronomy, cosmology is kind of missing the way the whole thing works in a sense?
Yes.
Well, how can you, how would you know that you're correct and the people you work with, and a lot of people and the other guys got it wrong? I mean, how do you know that?
The easiest way is to see the number of times you see headlines of reports from scientists and astronomers in particular, where they are surprised or even shocked by the results that come back. They're unexpected. Whereas I've been able to predict some of these unexpected results, sometimes years in advance, and quite often they've been outrageously at odds with what the astronomers themselves were expecting.
Now give us an example of that.
Yeah, I was going to say the best example was the impact of the projectile with the comet, called the Deep Impact Experiment. And I predicted as soon as they announced it that most of the things that were actually found and were a surprise to astronomers. There was the initial flash, which I said would be a result of the approach of a metal object at high speed to a charged comet. And then the outburst itself was unexpectedly bright, so bright in fact that they were unable to perform the main experiment, and that was to look at the crater after the impact. They had to make a return visit, and when they did the return visit, even then the crater didn't meet expectations, but it did meet my expectations and my predictions.
And your predictions were what?
My prediction was that the projectile would hit a rocky surface, and therefore there would be very little cratering. Most of the outburst that occurred, I said, was an electrical phenomenon. If you splatter copper, metal, across a charged object, then whatever discharge activity was taking place on that nucleus at the time would have been concentrated at that point, and therefore you would have got a much greater effect than you would expect from just a physical impact. And that, of course, is what happened.
And so the folks that are using the gravity model, you knew that what they were going to expect, but this particular thing was not going to happen, and it didn't.
Yes, that's right.
Huh. And so, so I'm still trying to understand the difference.
The difference was that the astronomers expected at the time that they would have a simple physical impact.
Just like,
and you can calculate the energy that would be involved. And I said, no, the outburst would be far more energetic. And also there would be this initial flash, this lightning flash, it's like walking across the carpet and grabbing a metal knob in a dry atmosphere. In this case, the copper projectile was approaching at a very high speed, so there was no chance of any adjustment in voltage before the copper projectile and the comet met. Mm-hmm. As a result, there would be this spark, at least. I said there'd be some kind of electrical flash. And the flash was observed. I was listening to the control room at the time, and great surprise was expressed. After the event, it was explained away as being due to a crust which was pierced by the projectile. But when the return visit occurred by that spacecraft to have a look at the impact, so the result was that they could hardly see a crater. So certainly there was no crust for it to burst through, but there's been no acknowledgement of the fact that their original explanation didn't work. It's more or less been forgotten that there was this initial flash. You don't see any mention of it. But that should have been sufficiently surprising, and my prediction 4 years in advance should have been worthy of a headline somewhere. And in fact, Time magazine picked up on it, and the editors in Australia chased me up for a story, but then it was rejected because somebody went to an expert and said, no, that's impossible. Unfortunately, this is the way things work when you come up with a big challenge to establish paradigms. No amount of evidence is good enough to shift that paradigm.
Not gravitational stuff is going on, but electrical stuff? Can it be put that simply, Wal?
Well, it's the sort of culmination of 40 or 50 years looking into these problems. Gravity certainly exists. The problem is we don't understand it. And what has become apparent to me is that gravity and magnetism are all just manifestations of the electric force. In other words, all the matter in the universe is made up of positive and negative charge, and even the neutrons themselves are made up of positive and negative charge. And because they cannot occupy the same position in space at any instant, there is slight leftover electrical forces. It's called dipole forces because the matter itself may be neutral, but the fact that the positive and negative charge is slightly separated will give you this dipole electric force. And the ideas in that sort of developed over many years because there have been people in the past, scholars in the past, who've proposed the idea that not only atoms are made up of positive and negative charge, but the actual subatomic particles themselves, the electron, the proton, the neutron, the things that the normal matter that we see is made up of, are also composites. And with that simple idea, it's a kind of repeated pattern, like the atomic structure within atomic structure, if you like. Just that simple pattern repeated is enough to give you some of the answers about magnetism and gravity. And it's just an odd thing to think that in this day and age, the nature of those forces is still regarded as somewhat mysterious, and yet we base our entire cosmology on those forces, magnetism and gravity.
Huh.
I feel quite privileged to be able to come to England and to pay tribute to David and also to Elizabeth. They've been great friends over quite a few years now. They visited us in Canberra on one occasion, and we visited them on many occasions when we've come to England. I particularly like this photograph. It should be a painting, I think. Okay, so David and I, most of our correspondence, which stretched over quite a few years, was about this collinear arrangement of planets, also known as the Proto-Saturnian story. So what I thought I'd do first is to just give you some impression of how I got involved in all of this. I was, of course, inspired by Velikovsky, not long after the first book was published, Worlds in Collision. So I went into university as a total skeptic, which I think is a great way to be at university. I managed to survive through till the postgraduate year and then gave up, realising there's no place for a heretic in academia. Anyway, many years later, I made first contact with the SIS in 1979. I was working for the Australian government at the Australian High Commission in London, and I organised to meet with Harold Tresman and Roy McKinnon. You can see in that photo that was in a cafe in Tottenham Court Road. And we discussed my possible involvement in the SIS. At that stage I didn't know that a little over, well, less than 2 years later I would be posted to London for 3 years. At that first visit in 1979, I met up with Malcolm Lowry because I'd been corresponding with him about a possible article for the SIS Review, and he encouraged me, and my very first article published in the SIS Review was due to him. It was about the recent evidence for Venus having been a new planet. Now, to do with Saturn in particular, 1977 marked the beginning of publications about Saturn, but I don't think I took a great deal of notice at the time. The 3 articles that came out were written by David Talbot, Radu Cardona, and jointly by Harold Tresman and Bernard Newgrosh, who was under the pen name of Brendan O'Gagan, I seem to recall. It was Emmanuel Velikovsky in that short article in Kronos, Volume 5, Number 1, that really made me think about it, because that was such an incredible leap from anything I'd heard before. But somehow, intuitively, I sensed that there was something to be investigated there, and that it did, in some ways, make good sense. The essay itself was based upon a lecture given by Velikovsky at the University of the New World, Valais, Switzerland, in 1971, but it referred back to an article in that he'd written called Saturn and the Flood back in the 1940s. So it has quite a history. In 1980, David Talbot published The Saturn Myth, which gave his reconstruction of what was seen in the ancient skies. I bought that book, and it was years later that somebody asked me if they could have a copy too. And that put me in touch with David Talbot once again, and from there the collaboration which has resulted in the Thunderbolts group in the US, that was born. My first real contacts, apart from the early meetings of the SIS in the early 80s, where I first met David and discovered that he was a man who was not to be put off by anything when he was inspired with an idea. When I came back in the late 80s on a second posting to London, which is highly unusual, I was involved both times with the committee. And there's a few photos here just as a reminder of some of the people who were involved at that time. David Roth, you can see. There's Bernard Newgrosh, Derek Shelley-Pearce and Alan Newby in the small cameos on the left. And of course Jill Avery features in the background. As Barry mentioned in an earlier address, David wasn't afraid of controversy. He defended Peter Warlow's elegant, and I think it was elegant, tip-top Earth inversion model against both the sceptics and the pseudo-sceptics, amongst whom I count Tim Thompson, who many of you know. And I thought that was an excellent piece of work. But David wrote to me about this question of external electromagnetic influences as being a driver for that tip-top or a trigger to cause the inversion of the Earth. And I think that's the most likely explanation. Because apart from the idea that the crust may be uncoupled from the core, because the core is supposed to be liquid, there is the issue that if the magnetic field of the Earth is largely due to the rotation of a charged body, and that rotation does not change in direction, then the magnetic field will not change, even if that body is inverted by that tip-top mechanism. So these are the sorts of things that David and I corresponded about. This is my first memory of the new house. I rather like it. I've actually printed a copy of this picture that I found on my archives and handed it to Elizabeth. They were good times. I've spoken on behalf of Eduardo earlier, and his address at the last Thunderbolts conference in the US was actually titled Strangers in a Foreign Galaxy. But I thought I'd just tone that down a little, because that's even more extreme than the idea that Proto-Saturn was just captured from the stars of our own galaxy. But he had arguments as to why he thought this might be the case for Proto-Saturn. I must say the Thunderbolts conferences are a real event to put on your calendar if you can possibly get to them. The next one is in March in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've been to that venue before and it works extremely well for us. And the people who speak to us after the conference say they've never been to a conference like it, because it doesn't matter what you're interested in, there's practically a speaker there who will address that issue. Not only that, all of the speakers converge in their ideas, and this is typical of the electric universe. Eduardo, of course, has published a number of books in a never-ending series, it seems, and Godstar is one of them, which is about this idea that Proto-Saturn, we call it Proto-Saturn because the planet we see today does not look anything like the object that it was before in its past history. I spent decades trying to figure out how you would get a linear arrangement of planets that could be dynamically stable. When I first went to Portland in 1994 to address the meeting that David Talbot had organised, the first international conference on the Saturn story, I had really at that stage no idea how this configuration that he was describing would work, except that I could see that the details that he'd deduced from the evidence showed that it was electrical discharges in a plasma that was involved. It took a long while to get over the idea that Einstein knew what gravity was all about, and in ditching that, to find a modified version of gravity. I mean, Newton had the sense not to propose a theory. He just described what gravity does in mathematical terms. The result of that has been, in the last few years, what I call electrically modified Newtonian dynamics. And that hinges on the fact that when you put charge on a planet or a star, or extract charge to any great degree, the actual apparent mass and gravity of that star or planet will change. And it works in a very simple way, so that it's possible, using this EMOND, electrically modified Newtonian dynamics, to explain how you end up with a stable system of many bodies orbiting the Sun after a very short period of time when chaos reigned. And this was something that had never been done before. And it's such a simple theory that I think it has considerable value. So this electrically modified Newtonian dynamics then helped explain the electrical capture of Proto-Saturn into the Sun system, the avoidance of planets of each other, and rapid orbit stabilisation. It also explains the transition of the captured system from a brown dwarf
system of planets to a gas giant and scattered objects within the solar system. It's interesting to note that the most recent National Geographic has the usual story, and that is our wild, wild solar system. And you see a Mars-sized object colliding with the Earth to provide us with a moon. This story is so incredible and impossible that it just fits together with the other theories about how the solar system was formed, all of which don't work. There's been various models of this polar configuration. One of them was put forward by Bob Grubauer at that 1994 meeting in Portland. And that was very clever, but I thought it was a very special kind of arrangement which had Jupiter as the sort of counterweight to this line of planets. It fulfilled the requirements of David Talbot's reconstruction and also Eduardo's, that Earth was one of Saturn's satellites initially. This thing was called the barbell model, but it required that the whole system rotated once. This line rotated once in each year, so it went around like this around the sun, which is a very special condition. I didn't like it, but Dave Talbot at that stage had been interested enough to see any explanation that it resurrected his interest in continuing, because he'd been rather discouraged by the sheer apparent impossibility of what he had reconstructed in the Saturn myth. You know, the usual old story, I don't have to go through that. You see it endlessly on television and so on, with gravitational collapse, and somehow or another it forms a disk of gas and dust. Somehow or another that forms planets, although Saturn's ring doesn't form anything at present. And also every new discovery of exoplanets has the theory discredited, this theory discredited. To begin with, they began to find super Jupiters, hot Jupiters, orbiting very close to the star. Well, according to this theory, they cannot exist except at some distance away from the star where those light gases aren't dispersed. So then they came up with migration of the planets, and it's got to the point now where we must have had another gas giant in our own solar system to be able to explain Neptune, because Neptune can't have formed where it is now.
Just wanted to say this, when it comes to Saturn theory, what else even comes close to being comparable with so many signatures of proof? I can't think of any. Accretion sure isn't it. I think about that a lot. It tells the story, and it has proof.
So it must have been knocked out there by a gas giant that no longer exists. It's getting just that crazy. On the right-hand side, you'll see a miniature solar system. This is the kind of thing that's being discovered. Red dwarfs have their own little planetary systems. But there's more to it than that, because the electric universe says we don't even understand our own star, and that stars are an electrical phenomenon themselves. And therefore, what is a red dwarf? Well, let's look at giant red stars, which we can see quite easily. Betelgeuse is a good example. Betelgeuse is so distended that if it was in the solar system, Jupiter would be orbiting just beneath the surface of that star. When I say that, these stars vary in radius for unknown reasons, and also have spots, hot spots, which are also unexplained. The electric universe says all red stars are giants, so there's no such thing as a red dwarf. A faint red star is still gigantic compared to a bright star. And the reason for that is that a red star has its plasma envelope expands to try and collect more electrons from the surrounding plasma to satisfy the discharge of that body at the centre. And so this red sphere of plasma is glowing at the outer periphery, largely, because that's where the electrons are accelerated. And inside, you've got a very thin gas. It's been said that the planets could quite easily orbit inside Betelgeuse's atmosphere because it's so thin. So you can have a planetary system inside a star. And this is an idea that
fits the work of Dwight Cardona in particular, about the earliest recollections of mankind about the light in the sky, the even temperatures and so on. So these all red stars have a bloated glowing plasma shell. If Jupiter's plasmasphere was visible, if it was glowing, it would appear as big as the full moon in the sky at night, yet it's a huge distance further away than the moon, just to give you an idea. So satellites may orbit within that plasmasphere, and in this case it's my contention that red dwarfs are the most likely place to find life in the universe, because here you have even heating of all the bodies orbiting within this plasma shell. It's like an incubator. The central star has a tendency to flare and throw off material into that atmosphere just to adjust to the electrical environment. And the early recollections are of a mist falling to the Earth continually. So the origin of the water on the Earth can be explained in this case, and also the icy satellites of the other gas giants. Where did all this water come from? And particularly on the Earth, I mean, we've got a huge amount of water, and in our position in the solar system, the standard theory says the sun should have blown that away. So there's an ad hoc theory that comets must have hit the Earth and produced the water, but now they find that the deuterium signature is wrong. So on and on it goes. This is a much simpler story. So, as I said, even red dwarf stars are gigantic. And the Earth, if it was orbiting, as I've shown here, inside that glowing plasma shell, every square metre on the surface of the Earth would receive the same amount of radiation, radiant energy. What's more, the colour of the light would tend to be purple, because you get UV and the violet end of the spectrum and the red end of the spectrum from this plasma. And that's the recollection of mankind, the purple dawn of creation. And the light was dim. Nowadays we know that red light is very conducive to photosynthesis. And what did we have? Huge forests covering the Earth in the polar regions as well. So all of the conditions are fulfilled here to explain all of these apparent anomalies. So this is a slide which sort of summarises the sun's environment to give us an idea of what proto-Saturn must have encountered as it approached our sun. It's not simple. In the early days when David and I were corresponding trying to figure it out, we both came to roughly the same kind of figures, about a century or less for proto-Saturn to approach the sun, enter the heliosphere and then break up. But when you look at this on the left-hand side, you can see what's called a planetary nebula. Now, these planetary nebulae are special cases where the circuit that drives the star is a light, and you can actually trace it. You can see it. And I've blown up the tiny bit at the centre, which is where the star is, and when you blow that up and then you go inside that, you find the heliosphere, and you see that the sun's heliosphere is actually a tiny part of a much bigger circuit. So proto-Saturn approaching the sun could have taken a very long time indeed, much more than centuries. And the effects on it would have been variable depending on where in this circuit it happened to be at the time. And one of the things that, as I said, a red dwarf star does to accommodate to its environment is to flare. And that's one of Dwight's tomes is called Flare Star, because that's the memory of mankind as well. This is taken on one of our many visits to the new house. Very many fond memories. And I have a saying, I think, that came from the Reader's Digest, that David was one of my most unforgettable characters. You know how you have certain people in your life that have an influence way beyond the ordinary? And David was one of those people. And with Elizabeth, they were wonderful hosts. And David was an indefatigable correspondent. I have many of his letters at home. I'm afraid I was rather lazy. I would wait till I came over and saw him face to face before I answered his questions. I've also got David to thank through Lee here for being invited to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institute just in 2010, I think it was, to address the audience there. My view has always been that the electric universe will only take root by networking. And that is, the more people we can address in as many venues as possible and via the internet, that's the chance for the future. That's the way things will happen. In fact, I think it's almost amazing how technology and this new paradigm have sort of grown together, because we definitely require the connectedness of the internet to demonstrate the connectedness of the electric universe. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have time for a quick question, I think.
Last time I went to you and now, you advocated the interaction between people to spread this message, to go forward.
Yes.
What I'd like to ask you is, you obviously have got an audience in things like the SIS and the New Mexico place that you talked about. Have you any interaction actually with the younger generation, say 11, 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds?
Yes.
Where you can interact at these events or such a time the same, so they can see how the grown-ups are thinking?
Yes. Well, just two examples. We had a teacher friend in Japan who was teaching at a school there to Japanese children who were learning English, and she knew of my work, and so I would speak to them on Skype. They would write their questions out and come up to the camera and ask their question politely, and then they projected me from Australia on a big screen, and I gave them an answer which I hoped was at their level and to hope to inspire them. So that was one of my little efforts. The other thing is that the Thunderbolts group are well aware of this problem of trying to involve younger people, and so for the last 2 years we have instituted a scholarship program. And one of those, they've been quite successful, by the way. One of the scholarship winners never went to university, but he's obviously a very bright fellow. He is now a laboratory manager. Another one has joined Jerry Pollack, Professor Jerry Pollack at the University of Washington, and working on this, the electrical nature of water in biology, which is fantastic work. Jerry Pollack is a big supporter of us, and we of him. So at the last meeting, I think we had about a dozen people, young people, and they seemed to have a great time. They were talking. They collared me many times in the corridor, and I'd get sore legs standing there talking to them. So there's definitely an interest out there, and we're doing everything we can to encourage it.
May I suggest you write a children's book on sort of like the beginnings, electrons, protons, and go up through to where the electric universe is?
Very good suggestion.
If they're interested in it?
Yeah, I have. My plan is to write the complete electric universe, because I've never actually gone into all the corners that the EU has an impact.
May I encourage that?
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a little problem with the end of your presentation.
Yes.
When you said the title of Cardona's book was Flare Star, and at the time the Earth would have been within the outer globe surface of the great star.
Yes.
Now, if something flared, it would be out on the outer globe surface.
Not necessarily. No, the central object is the main charged object, the anode in the discharge, if you like. And if the disturbance is sufficient, the anode itself will disgorge material. And this appears to happen. Red stars have surprised astronomers by A, producing jets, and also strong X-ray outbursts and flares. None of these things are supposed to happen in a star that never quite made it.
The other point was, under that scenario, you can't have any ice on the surface. You can't have ice on the surface of the Earth.
No, if the...
Cardona seems to think you could.
He's got an interesting model, which I think is very inventive. As to whether it's correct or not, that's up for discussion. This is the fun of the discovery, of course, is people throwing objections, and then you've got to go away and think about it. You don't just dismiss these things out of hand. So he's made some good arguments. Yeah. And I think that happened actually after the split, the breakup, though.
So the surface of the ice is, thousands of years, whatever it is, that the sun was already influencing, and of course the heavy light, the glow of the inner part of the star is already
Yes, yeah. That's a bit of a complicated question. I'd have to research it to give you a good answer.
No, I was trying to get your gauge of how long ago
Oh, I see.
the ice on the surface of the Earth.
Yeah, this is one of the questions he gets asked all the time, and all he can say is it's roughly coincides with the end of the last ice age, which of course is a bit of a circular argument. It's very hard to tell, of course, because our normal means of dating rocks and things is in question with all of this.
You would say that the ice has to stage the collapse of the outer sphere.
I'm not sure. I'd have to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Wasn't Proto-Saturn supposed to have been a cathodic star?
The definite.
Approach the anodic sun.
Yeah, the character of a body, whether it's an anode or a cathode, is entirely dependent on its environment. And in the case of the heliosphere, because the Sun is a much more positively charged dynamic body than Proto-Saturn was, based on its brightness, then Proto-Saturn outside the heliosphere was a star, but as soon as it entered the heliosphere, it was suddenly negatively charged with respect to the Sun. So it's always with respect to something. In that case, it switched from being a star to a comet, because the standard activity of a body that's approaching the Sun that's negatively charged is to discharge as a comet. And I think that's what the origin of the polar column was, because we were sitting by then in the tail of this discharge. That's the most likely thing, I think. Yeah.
Degrees of negativity.
Yeah. When you say something is positive or negative, it has to be with respect to something. You know.
You mentioned at the beginning of your lecture about the Earth being within, if you like, the sphere of this red star. And you also mentioned that there were lots of forests scattered all over the Earth.
Yes.
Now, the thing is, the atmosphere of the Earth, would it have had the carbon dioxide required for photosynthesis and the evolution of oxygen, and would not the atmosphere of the, if you like, the environment in which the Earth was placed have engulfed any atmosphere that might have existed?
The atmosphere of the Earth, we know, was different back then. There's much more oxygen, apparently, and presumably the carbon dioxide must have been there for whatever reason. Part of it due to the carbon compounds that we find on those bodies that are out there orbiting Saturn right now. Titan is a good example. And also Venus was born from Proto-Saturn. It too has an incredibly thick atmosphere, just like Titan, only a different composition. And I've explained why there's a difference in one of my articles on my website. So it makes a coherent story, and it's also been predictive. I was the only one who predicted that what they would find beneath the clouds on Titan. I was the only one who predicted that the poles of Saturn would be found to be hot, although it had just come out of 14 years in darkness. All of these things are easy to predict from the new model, and the success rate has been what you would expect if we're on the right track.
The sun just dominates our sky as the source of light and warmth and life itself on Earth. And this preeminence of the sun is so clear and obvious that it remains a mystery why virtually every ancient culture insisted that before the present sun, there was a quite different luminary ruling the sky. The central sun, the superior sun, the best sun, the motionless sun. And all of these cultures, whatever may be the meaning of these traditions, are insisting that the sky has changed. Of course, our ideas about the sun have continually changed. Only a few centuries ago, the sun was a campfire or ember in the sky. Then early in the 20th century, under the influence of gravitational theory, the sun was seen as a gravitationally collapsing nebular cloud. In the atomic age, astronomers began to visualize the sun in terms of a nuclear furnace hidden at its core. But now we're in the age of plasma science, with discoveries of the electric currents in space. And it's inconceivable that these discoveries would not change the picture of the sun again.
plasma cosmologists have been able to demonstrate experimentally and also in the supercomputer that galaxies are an electrical phenomenon, which raises the question about stars, and in particular our own sun, which is the closest star to the Earth, of course. Any theory of the sun has to explain how it could continue to burn for billions of years, and also explain its present size based on its known mass. And of course, as soon as nuclear energy was discovered, it was grasped immediately as the energy source of the sun. But all of that assumes that the sun is disconnected and an isolated body, and that it must consume itself over its lifetime to provide the heat and light that we receive from it. But if the sun is connected to the rest of the galaxy in an electrical sense, it doesn't require to burn itself at all. And the energy that we receive is actually being received from the galaxy, and the sun is acting as a focus for that energy.
The sun is actually a fairly typical star. And so if we want to understand stars and cosmology, we really have to understand the sun. And the standard model of the sun, so-called, that astronomers are so very proud of these days, really doesn't explain very much about the sun. Why is there a corona in the first place? Everybody knows about the corona, the beautiful corona that we see during solar eclipses. Why is it there? It's clearly an electrical phenomenon.
One of the greatest puzzles about the sun has been, with a surface temperature of 6,000 degrees, high above that surface we have temperatures of millions of degrees. And the question has been, how do we get the energy from the center of the sun somehow past that surface to heat the upper atmosphere of the sun to millions of degrees? In the electric model, you don't have that problem, because if the energy is arriving from outside the sun, the first place you expect to see that energy expressed is above the sun in its tenuous atmosphere. And that is the place where particle acceleration occurs, and the apparent temperature goes very high indeed, up into the millions of degrees.
The fact that the particles in the solar wind accelerate, that is to say, increase their velocity with increasing distance away from the sun, the farther away they get, the faster they go. And the fact that those particles are indeed charged particles leads me, as an electrical engineer, to come to the immediate conclusion that this is an electrical process. In the solar model, think of the sun as being a positive anode, very high voltage body that obviously would emanate an electric field. And if you put a charged particle in an electric field, it will accelerate. That's the way we accelerate particles here on Earth. It's the way every physicist and electrodynamicist has ever increased the velocity of a charged particle, is put it in an electric field.
One of the features we observe on the sun, which have no business being there, according to the standard model, are sunspots. The most significant thing about a sunspot is the fact that the center of the sunspot is dark. And if the sun is trying to radiate energy from its core into space, we should expect that it is bright.
And if you think about that umbra, that darkest place in the center of sunspots, that's the place where we can see deepest into the sun. And just consider the fact that at that point where we can really see down into the sun, that's the absolute coldest place that we are able to measure. If the center of the sun is really a nuclear fusion furnace, it should be the hottest because we're closest to the source, and it's not the case. You ask any astronomer, why are there sunspots? Why are the umbra dark? They will blame it on some sort of warped, twisted magnetic fields. They will say that it has to do with the solar dynamo, all of which lurk unseen like a big genie somewhere below the surface. These phenomena are only to be expected if the sun is electrical in nature. Astrophysicists make the claim that the solar fusion model has indeed been tested in the laboratory, and nothing really is further from the truth. Although each of the steps involved in the hydrogen to helium fusion reaction have indeed been verified experimentally, the overall experiment, the overall reaction, has never been produced in a continuous laboratory experiment. Continuous hydrogen to helium fusion has not been attained in the lab. The strength, in fact, of the electric cosmology is that indeed all of the mechanisms that the electrical people talk about have indeed been verified over decades, in fact, at least a century, in the laboratory. The plasma scaling is well known, and plasma and electrical experiments have verified every step of the way. There are any number of observations that have ad hoc present explanations, but really have no explanation in the standard model, and are natural consequences of the electrical model. For example, heavy elements, the solar spectrum, the neutrino deficiency, the neutrino variability, solar atmosphere, differential rotation by latitude, differential rotation by depth, equatorial plasma torus, sunspots, sunspot migration, the sunspot penumbra, and the sunspot cycle itself. Magnetic field strength, the even magnetic field, helioseismology, the solar density, and the changing size. All of the observations that in that list are natural consequences of the electrical sun model. Standard astronomers tend to pass them off as being inconsequential difficulties that will eventually someday be solved. I maintain, and so do our colleagues here, that these are not inconsequential, but are rather death blows to the solar fusion model, because they are important. They're not secondary. They're primary falsifying observations for that failed nuclear fusion model.
What I find so fascinating about the electric model of the sun is not just that it's a challenge to long-standing theory, but that it opens the door to the ancient world, to an electric sky. The electromagnetic phenomena that we now observe on the surface of the sun and in the vicinity of the sun are direct pointers backwards to the plasma formations that were seen above the ancient sky worshippers. And yet now we know that the electric force is active from microcosm to macrocosm. And how many people here would want to defend the idea that spectacular structures in space of this sort can be reconstructed through Newton's gravitational equation? We honor pioneers such as Christian Birkeland and Hannes Alfvén, experimental pioneers in the role of electricity in space. And dozens of others could be mentioned. The key components of an electric universe paradigm are, first, electric currents across cosmic distances. That's across interstellar and intergalactic distances. Electric galaxy formation, electric star formation, electric sun and electrified heliosphere, electrical scarring of planets and moons, electric comets, that's comets plunging through the electric field of the sun to discharge electrically. The electricity of life, a huge new domain of investigation within the electric universe community today. The quantum role of the electric force, I know many people in the NPA are exploring this, and the connection to the underpinnings of gravity itself and the electrified ancient sky. That's my own field of concentrated study for decades, and I'm really not going to even touch that field here today, other than to say it does bring the electric universe with it. Now, I formulated what I call a core prediction of the electric universe, based simply on observation of what's in the science news these days. When we examine energetic events in space, we'll always find electromagnetic intensities far beyond the ability of prior theory to explain them. And we see this as science coming to the electric universe through the back door. It is not possible in the vacuum of space to create a magnetic field or to sustain a magnetic field in the absence of electric currents. We're talking about converging evidence, and we can bring the focus down to our own cosmic neighborhood and explore the sun. When the fundamentals of a theory are falsified by unexpected findings, a new vantage point is required, one that explains and predicts the surprises without introducing new contradictions. The conjectured Oort cloud freezer, forming and preserving comets for billions of years, is falsified by the Wild 2 findings. Only the diverse surface environments of rocky planets can provide the required raw material, and only the recent formation of comets can explain why these rapidly degraded objects are still with us. The bold question must now be asked: were comets created in recent periods of planetary instability and intense electrical events? Would minerals formed in liquid water then come as a surprise? Would comets now exhibiting no water be a surprise? Or crystalline structures suggesting igneous processes, or minerals pointing to the exceedingly high temperatures of lightning? A more unified picture of comet formation is available to us. And if comets were born electrically, what might the causative connection be to asteroids and meteorites, the apparent cousins of the comet? The Wild 2 mineral cubonite, a copper iron sulfide, is abundant on Earth and so too on Mars. In fact, it's found in Martian meteorites now known to have been blasted up to escape velocity from the surface of Mars, later to arrive at Earth. A few years ago, things now stated by astronomers would have been considered preposterous. Astronomers now acknowledge that the Martian moon Phobos, long called a captured asteroid, was formed out of material blasted from the Martian surface. For the source of a comet's constituent materials, planets close to the Sun's habitable zone are the most reasonable places to look. The foremost candidate is the planet Mars. In this intellectual adventure, we must revisit all earlier ideas about solar system history. Evidence for high-energy electrical events can no longer be ignored. The popular billion-year scenarios describing a comet's origins will be displaced by things now established as fact. And the changing picture of solar system history will surely not stop at the new story of the comet.
Explained the white crown of Egypt and the rest of these things that he showed us, all from mythology, all from thousands of years ago. These things clearly were seen by civilizations that never talked to each other from the far corners of the earth. It all just clicked together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle in my mind.
A breakthrough for me came when I realized that many different cultures spread around the world use different words, different symbols, different myths to describe precisely the same formations in the sky. The Ouroboros, or celestial serpent biting its tail, for example, occurs on every habitable continent, but it has no ties to the world we now observe. Like all of the archetypes, it is part of an alien sky. A cosmic column rising to the center of the sky, holding aloft the wheel of heaven. And much more than a wheel, because this was the revolving cosmic temple, the city of the gods, the kingdom of heaven, always resting on the cosmic column. Then there's the image of the four rivers or pathways radiating from the center of the sky out to the boundary, the rim of the wheel. The simplest forms lead you invariably to the full story of world mythology. The hero's journey unfolds as the story of the wheel's axle. The mother goddess finds her identity in the star at the summit, the hub and spokes of the wheel.
One of the most interesting phenomena in the sky is the so-called pulsar. A pulsar is an object that is observed to put out pulses, both of light and radio activity, RF, in the RF spectrum. And those pulses are extremely rapid. They are something like milliseconds apart. So it's like a extremely fast strobe light. And thinking of a strobe light, astronomers immediately leapt to the lighthouse kind of analogy. Something that must be spinning around, the beam is going around, and it's going around so quickly that this thing goes flash, flash, flash. Well, once the repetition rate of the pulsars was observed to get up to in the millisecond range, that meant that this star that was putting out this beam of radiation would have had to be rotating at 300 times a second. And 300 times a second, we're talking about the speed of a dentist drill. So the astronomers decided, well, normal stars couldn't possibly rotate at that speed, and so they postulated the existence of what they called a neutron star. A neutron star is a star that is so dense that it holds together so well that it can indeed rotate at the speed of a dentist's drill. Well, the problem is that in nuclear chemistry, we know that you can't pack neutrons together that densely. They will all fly apart instantaneously. There's a principle called the island of stability in nuclear chemistry that absolutely prevents that. So here again we have the standard astronomers or astrophysicists going directly against another well-developed science. In the electrical model, however, there's a very simple explanation for pulsars. Everybody is familiar with the idea that the pulses can travel back and forth on electrical transmission lines. Such uncontrolled pulses, for example, were responsible for the famous Northeast blackouts. A similar effect can occur between two binary stars connected by a plasma. The two binary stars act like capacitors that store charge. And if you reduce that in size to something you can produce in the laboratory, you can produce it in the laboratory, and it's called a relaxation oscillator. And electrical engineers use it and have used it for decades. The idea of producing pulses every few milliseconds is a sophomore level experiment in an electrical engineering laboratory.
Strobe light.
It doesn't require neutronium, strange matter, or any other fictitious device. All it requires is two capacitors, a battery, and a nonlinear resistor. And we maintain that that's exactly what a binary pair of stars connected by a plasma field presents. A typical ion in the solar wind, hydrogen nucleus, moving about 20 kilometers per second, which is relatively slow for the ions in the solar wind, in the magnetic field of the sun, experiences potentially magnetic forces that are something like 10 million times the strength of the gravitational force on that same ion from the sun. An interesting demonstration that illustrates very readily the relative strength of magnetic force and gravitational force is the simple idea of a ball bearing sitting on a wooden table. the entire mass of the Earth is pulling downward on that little ball bearing, and that's what prevents it from flying out into space. But a child can come along with a little horseshoe magnet and click, pick that ball bearing up instantly.
The space age presents us with an interesting paradox. The technology of science is really quite extraordinary, and technology has taken us out into space, taken us to the moon, taken probes to distant planets, opened up whole new vistas in remote space.
We've got a whole new universe, and theoreticians are still trying to look at it through, a friend of mine says they're peering through the wrong end of the telescope and telling us what they imagine they see.
Modern cosmology gives us a rather disconnected view of the universe. In other words, we are separated star from star by vast distances. Light takes a long time to travel between stars and across galaxies, and therefore we look upon ourselves as isolated and disconnected. The electric universe takes a different view. It says that we are a part of the sun's environment, electrical environment, and the sun is a part of the galactic environment, and the galaxy itself is strung, like all galaxies, on huge electric currents flowing through the universe.
One of the typical questions that plasma cosmologists hear all the time is, how do you know what's out there in space? How do you know there's electricity out there in space? Is there energy out there in space? Why should we consider anything more than gravity? And the answer is that through the years we've used optical telescopes, but recently we have what are called radio telescopes, and we've broadened the spectrum that we can look at the sky with. And those radio telescopes can measure electric currents and magnetic fields, and we can determine from those measurements the strength of the electric currents, the strength of the forces involved, and the amount of energy that's stored out there in space.
The two major pillars of modern cosmology are based on the theories of relativity and quantum theory, and yet, as Einstein himself noted, the two are incompatible. And that may be because the theories of relativity deal with matter as if its only consequence is the bending of space. The electric universe, on the other hand, deals with the electrical structure of matter at the subatomic level and then works its way up through living systems, if you like, planets, stars, galaxies, and the entire universe, and shows that it is the electrical structure of matter that forms the amazing shapes we see in deep space.
The spicules of the sun have to be investigated from a new vantage point, and so much of this has to do with the interfacial dynamics of different plasma regions and charged particles being launched into higher regions and so on. And both Don Scott and Wal Thornhill place a great emphasis on the study of the spicule dynamics.
Mainstream theory regards the cause of such granulation to originate from convection columns emanating from the solar interior. Jurgens was highly critical of the notion that violent convection from an exploding nuclear core can be observed in the photosphere of the sun.
Just imagine having to defend the idea that an infinitesimal speck inside that glow to the lower left is producing all of this. The truth is that if you had an electron microscope to look at this image at this scale, you would not see the black hole. And if the image that you did see was brought up and you had another electron microscope to look, you still wouldn't see the black hole. How did it happen that we became so confined theoretically that we are required to look inside that galactic core
and ignore the charged particles that constitute a sea of plasma, filling this unbelievable volume of space. And it really is impossible to wrap our minds around that. It is shooting charged particles away from the black hole at the center of M87. It's important for everyone considering an electric universe paradigm to wrap their minds as best they can around the distance involved in these stupendous jets. I mean, how far does light travel in a second? 186,000 miles. How far does it travel in a year? It's something like 5.88 trillion miles. And that's a light year, of course. These distances are typically counted in parsecs. A parsec is 3.26 light years. This jet is 50,000 parsecs. And now it's measured electrically. Measurement of the electric current in a kiloparsec scale jet. Obtaining for the first time a direct determination of a galactic scale electric current 3 × 10⁸ amps. It's just unfathomable what is occurring across this unimaginable distance of vacuum in space. Our analysis strongly supports a model where the jet energy flow is mainly electromagnetic. There are no islands in space.
Since discovering Immanuel Velikovsky's work via Wallace Thornhill and the Electric Universe, more specifically his video Understanding Gravity, I think it was around June 2014, so I've been into this for 5 years now. Man, time really flies. Of course, I was expecting the usual, to be honest. Pretty much daily for a couple of years, all I ever saw on the side for suggestions. And, I would often peruse any video on space or history, come to think of it. I watched everything they had. Wal's video popped up one day. I don't know if there's a way they can rig videos to appear more often than others. I assume there is. They probably have a system.
I searched electricity in space.
I don't know if they do that, but it's kind of funny that it took a couple of years for one Electric Universe video to pop up. Maybe it was just dumb luck. But I started watching the video and I was in about 30 seconds after, he gets going. Big aficionados who have this ridiculous epicycle scam running on all of us, Once you get into the EU, then mainstream videos don't cut it no more because you see right through it. It beats the heck out of me why people will reject it out of hand as a knee-jerk reaction. Defend it. When you watch an Electric Universe video, they just hit fact after fact, correct predictions. I haven't found one thing where they're wrong yet. I just really like it, and it changed my life. These guys are doing some really good work. Hopefully one day we can get this recognized as the mainstream science, and I'll tell you, it'll change the world. It'll change transportation, medicine, everything. The only thing that the mainstream big bangers have is insults. Or, they'll say something like being funny, like security, or call me a nut, or, that's just, that's really weak. But it's all they've got. They can't beat you with facts. Mainstream cosmology does not have one prediction to their credit. That's hard to believe, but it's true. Well, do it. Feel free to like, share, and comment, donate, and if you want, copy it. Spread the word, as people need to know this. This is important stuff. Okay, I'll see you next time. Take care.
I posted this video like 2 years ago. I just rediscovered it. I said, oh, this is a pearl. Oh, people got to see this. Yeah. I might have one more thing up my sleeve, and then I'm gonna go. I just wanted to show this video.
Okay, bear with me. I gotta find something else. I kind of got caught with my pants down. I wasn't expecting it to end so quick. I hope everybody's doing good out there. And let's see if we can find something good. Let's see.
There are no islands in space.
And in fact, it's in the works.
Found it.
Really close relationship between Earth and Saturn, which was the source of all the water in our oceans, while leaving remnants in its rings. Today, Thornhill continues his presentation, shifting his focus to his own successful predictions for the Saturnian system, including the mysterious moon Titan.
Before I tell the epic story, a warning. Our education systems train students to memorize a litany of facts, which produces global groupthink. Students are not given the time or encouragement to critically examine the history of ideas. A leading researcher into the learning functions of the divided brain, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, has shown such blinkered left hemisphere training renders students functionally blind to alternative ways of looking at a problem. The left hemisphere simply blocks out everything that doesn't fit with its take. It doesn't see it, actually, at all. So scientists with their narrow specialised training may look at but cannot see what to a non-expert may seem obvious. They will be the last to see a paradigm shift in the making. This is particularly evident for electrical phenomena in space. Even the Nobel Prize-winning founder of the idea of an electric universe, Hans Ophuijsen, was ignored when he warned in his 1970 acceptance speech of an inevitable crisis in astrophysics if electric circuits in space are not recognised. Houston, we still have that problem after almost 50 years. I have lived since a teenager with uncertainty about accepted truths and learned to have the courage to challenge them. The result is not chaos, but a synthesis of ideas that explains the old ideas better and finds new ways of incorporating what seems a chaos of anomalies. And the best test is that of classical physics, simplification. The resulting paradigm shift is not a threat, but an invitation to the greatest adventure we may ever know, to begin to understand our real place in the universe for the first time. In our electric universe, stars and planets are formed at the same time inside molecular clouds, along a snaking cosmic lightning bolt. Gravity plays no role in the process. Since cosmic lightning takes the form of a twisted pair of current filaments, it is found that most stars are in pairs, or multiples.
Spooky
Planets
tooth.
will tend to do the same. Like the snaking filaments in a novelty plasma ball, the star-forming filament moves on, leaving a string of massive objects behind to gravitationally form the weird and theoretically challenging zoo of exoplanetary systems recently discovered. Some gas giant planets are subsequently formed in close orbits about a star that has ejected charged matter to achieve stability with a changed electrical environment. The ejection flares may account for the flickering of newborn stars, which can't be explained by gravitational accretion. This explains the unexpected hot Jupiters seen in large numbers closely orbiting other stars. The most numerous stars in the galaxy, brown dwarfs, which would appear reddish if they could be seen with the naked eye, are generally classed as failed stars, yet they have the baffling ability to produce massive stellar flares. This is simply explained because red stars don't have the ability of main-sequence bright stars to control their current by a transistor-like action in their photospheric plasma. A brown dwarf can only respond by discharging matter electrically. The capture process of a brown dwarf star involves flaring and ejection of charged matter by that body in order to achieve a new electrical equilibrium in its adopted family. That accounts for the large number of close-orbiting moons of our captured gas giants in remote orbits. With this in mind, I want to take you back to just before the famous Cassini-Huygens space probe was to arrive at Saturn on July 1st, 2004. In news reports, Saturn was dubbed the original Lord of the Rings. There is a profound truth behind such a glib turn of phrase, but it wasn't until the advent of the telescope that Christian Huygens in 1656 was able to suggest that Saturn had a ring. So how do we explain the Saturnian ring symbolism that pervades our cultures? The halo of the saints, the royal crown, and the ring given in marriage are Saturnian symbols, as are the circled or Celtic cross, the Egyptian Ansate cross or Ankh, the Eye of Ra, and the astronomically baffling star inside the crescent. The star at the top of the lighted Christmas tree is pure Saturnian imagery. It is truly amazing that we are still haunted by prehistoric archetypes. It helps us to understand the extraordinary archetypal attraction of Tolkien's fantasy of Lord of the Rings. He was well versed in mythology. The following description of events is based on the surprisingly detailed and truly remarkable scholarship of Talbot and Cardona, which required explanations with the physics of an electric universe. Let's call our primordial star Proto-Saturn. It was an independent brown dwarf with its own entourage of satellites, including the Earth, Mars, and Titan. Proto-Saturn's dim reddish light was due to a glowing red anode plasma sheath, much larger than the Sun, enclosing Proto-Saturn and its inner satellites in a radiant cell. The term dwarf star is purely theoretical, since they are difficult to see and measure. In fact, NASA reported a brown dwarf which was radiating as if it had twice the expected surface area. The environment inside the radiant red shell is most hospitable for life on any enclosed satellites because there are no seasons and water is conspicuous in the spectra of such stars. Water misted down on this planet continually, and red light is ideal for photosynthesis, which explains the abundance of ferns and other vegetation globally in the Carboniferous era. But there is a catch. Brown dwarf stars are known to flare, sometimes to the extent, as one astronomer commented, that any satellites would suffer a very bad day. Such flaring by Proto-Saturn accounts for the geological strata and the fossil record of a number of global mass extinctions and instant burial of dismembered plant and animal remains. As we approached the Sun from deep space, our plasma sheath flickered like a faulty electric light when the two stellar plasma sheaths, or magnetospheres, began to clash. Proto-Saturn's galactic electrical power was usurped by the Sun, and its appearance changed dramatically. Before dimming forever, the dwarf star Proto-Saturn would have flared brilliantly like a comet, ejecting charged matter to relieve the electrical stresses caused by the sudden change in environment. Even now the former star has not completely cooled. Saturn still radiates more than twice the heat it receives from the Sun. And we have a simple explanation for the origin of Saturn's mysteriously short-lived water ice rings. As the Proto-Saturnian system approached the Sun in the outer solar system, our minor star's gravitational sphere of influence steadily shrank, and its outer satellites were progressively stripped away. This, and the earlier capture of the other gas giants, provides the source of trans-Neptunian objects as they're known, including Pluto with its unexpected geology and atmosphere, and its peculiar moons. There is a simple physical characteristic that links a captured star with its offspring. It is the axial tilts. Like our close-orbiting moon, satellites tend to orbit their primary with the same face always turned toward it. If they orbit in the equatorial plane, their spin axis will be aligned with that of the primary. As gyroscopes, the satellites will retain the same tilt even if jolted from their orbit, although the process may induce a wobble of the spin axis. It is therefore highly significant that the two key planets identified in the ancient pantheons, Saturn and Mars, have axial tilts closely similar to that of the Earth. The tilt of Saturn at 27 degrees to the ecliptic plane is itself an enigma, unless it formed independently from the Sun. Venus was described as a spectacular discharging body in the ancient congregation of planets. It can be explained if Venus was ejected in the flare-up of Proto-Saturn and the infall of the stream of ejected matter from swiftly rotating Proto-Saturn gave Venus a slow retrograde spin. The magnitude of the axial tilt of Venus to the ecliptic is much less than Saturn's, which suggests that Venus was ejected from a low latitude. This accounts for the hellish temperature and new surface of Venus, having been recently spat from the mantle of a brown dwarf star. Its filamentary equatorial scars caused by spectacular radial discharging, and its thick atmosphere inherited from the brown dwarf and subsequently modified by interplanetary and cometary discharges. Venus still has a cometary magnetotail stretching to the Earth's orbit, and its mountain tops glow with plasma discharges, which return Magellan's radar signals as unexplained shininess. Magellan's radar also showed Venus has a surprisingly young surface that gave rise to ad hoc theories of resurfacing events. They're unnecessary. Venus is a baby. Since my predictions were written in 2004, the electrogravity model has been further developed, and it explains electrogravitational capture and the rounding of cometary orbits by electrical discharge. It explains the huge capture cross-section of stars and why the observed phenomenal discharging of cometary Venus caused it to finally have the most circular orbit of any planet. The electric universe conceptual model can claim a number of successful predictions. Significantly, it was the only model to predict the surface features of smog-shrouded Titan before the Huygens probe revealed them in detail. Titan, which is 50% larger than our Moon, is an enigma for astronomers, having a global orange haze that has prevented us from seeing surface features. It has a massive atmosphere, mainly of nitrogen, with a pressure at the surface like that at the bottom of a swimming pool. The atmosphere also contains methane and at least 9 other organic molecules. The methane is being continually destroyed by solar radiation, which raises a further problem about its source of resupply if the Moon is 4.6 billion years old. This has led to widespread speculations of Titan possibly being covered by an approximately 1 kilometre deep ocean of liquid ethane. However, radar, infrared and radio observations of Titan have not found signs of a hydrocarbon ocean. In fact, one radar return was of a type that we would expect to get back from Venus. But Titan is not 4.6 billion years old, and the Earth did not form where we find it today. Instead, Saturn's largest moon, Titan, is a child of Saturn and a sibling of Venus, Earth and Mars. I wrote just before Cassini arrived at Saturn, "We should be alert to similarities between Titan and Venus." On November 29, 2006, the Dallas Morning News reported, when the $3 billion Cassini spacecraft sailed past Titan 3 weeks ago, it was supposed to clear up many of the mysteries about Saturn's largest moon. Instead, it has left scientists more befuddled. The new Cassini images do not support previous theories about Saturn's moon. In New Scientist of November 6, 2004, Titan images add to Moon's mystery, Stephen Battersby reported. The world got its first peek at the surface of Saturn's moon Titan last week. The images were taken as NASA's Cassini-Huygens spacecraft swept past the moon. The images show a landscape that is clearly still being shaped. Although Titan must have suffered numerous meteor impacts in the past, its surface today is largely crater-free. Somehow these scars must have been eroded or filled in. We are seeing a place that is alive, geologically speaking, says Charles Ilachi, head of the team running Cassini's radar instrument. I commented at the time, that is precisely what was said about Venus when the Magellan orbiter revealed that planet's surface. It is only supposition that Titan's surface is still being shaped. It's based on the belief that Titan must have suffered numerous meteor impacts in the past, and therefore something must have occurred from within the moon to fill the craters. However, like Venus, there may have been no impact craters to fill. For that matter, no one has witnessed a large crater-forming meteor impact. The report continued, suggestions of an active dynamic surface on Titan are beginning to emerge. Not a single crater has been identified yet, which means the surface must be young and active, just as Saturn hasn't had time to lose its rings following its last discharge. In this picture, we now have the key to understanding what shapes Titan's landscape, said Dr. Martin Tomasco, principal investigator for the Descent Imager Spectral Radiometer, adding, geological evidence for precipitation, erosion, mechanical abrasion, and other fluvial activity says that the physical processes shaping Titan are much the same as those shaping Earth. These comments demonstrate the problem of interpretation when the model is geocentric. Methane is a non-polar molecule which doesn't form clouds and rain like electrically polarized water molecules do. So precipitation, erosion and other fluvial activity will not occur, much the same as those shaping Earth. Finally, returning to Venus, why is its atmosphere so different to the other planets and Titan? The atmosphere of Venus is mostly carbon dioxide, 96.5% by volume. Most of the remaining 3.5% is nitrogen. This inhospitable mix is accompanied by clouds of sulfuric acid. I explained in my 2004 article, Venus probably began with an atmosphere more like Titan's and the Earth's, where nitrogen dominates and with more water. On the Venusian surface, nitrogen molecules require very little energy to transmute to carbon monoxide molecules by a catalytic surface nuclear reaction in the presence of red-hot iron. The brilliant French chemist Louis Kervran, when investigating carbon monoxide poisoning of welders, discovered this surprising transmutation. The carbon monoxide then reacts at the hot surface of Venus with water vapour to form carbon dioxide and hydrogen, in a well-known industrial process. The hydrogen produced escapes from Venus. This process explains the puzzling discovery made by Venus landers that the water vapour concentration diminished as they approached the Venusian surface. But decisively, it explains the heavy carbon dioxide atmosphere and little remaining nitrogen on Venus. It also explains the steady stream of hydrogen escaping from the top of Venus's atmosphere at present and the phenomenally high proportion, 120 times that on Earth, of heavy hydrogen or deuterium left behind in its atmosphere. What I've attempted to show here is a coherent story using forensic evidence stretching back into prehistory of celestial events involving planets and their electrical thunderbolt interactions. A new picture of the universe results from paying heed to Alfvén's warning to introduce electric universe science into cosmology. This is a fundamental shift from the ad hoc theoretical approach, which has no theory explaining the force of gravity, and so, unsurprisingly, no success trying to introduce order into a chaos of anomalies. It has no chance of ever discovering that we are children of the planet and former brown dwarf star, Saturn. This is an invitation to the greatest adventure, to begin to understand our real history and place in the universe for the first time, and that must bring about a much-needed cultural change that may dwarf the scientific revolution. That change is essential if we are to have a future, because the post-traumatic stress disorder we have inherited threatens our very existence on this planet. It manifests as a desire not to know the shocking truth because it exposes our existential fears. As Roger Westcott ably expressed it, man is a wounded animal. His survival is astonishing. but his inability to heal his wounds is tragic. It is tragic because, as Velikovsky argued, being descendants of the survivors of great paroxysms of nature of the past, we are possessed by the urge inherited through racial memory to repeat the violent performance. And it was his greatest fear that we now had the destructive capability to produce our own doomsday. Along with that genius Carl Jung, he warned that mankind is his own worst enemy. So the cultural change offered by electric universe cosmology is essential for our survival. By offering a real understanding of the universe and our history, it offers hope and inspiration where presently there is none. There is far more to life in the electric universe than is dreamt of presently. We are all intimately connected with each other and the Earth. Enjoy the Saturnian Festival of Lights and the New Year.
Black holes do us no good. That is just so good. Got something else for you. It's coming right up.
The second astronomer who criticized Velikovsky's electromagnetic concept in the early part of the Velikovsky affair was James Warwick, who specifically wrote a paper on magnetic stars that, like Menzel's, was supposedly a devastating calculation and rebuttal to Velikovsky. He claimed that the astronomers had been working with magnetic star motions for years and found nothing to indicate their high magnetic fields had any influence on motion in this regard. The original criticism appeared in Chronos, Volume 10, Number 3, 1985, pages 10 and 11. My answer to Warwick was published 3 years later. Immanuel Velikovsky claimed that two magnetic stars orbiting at close quarters would not be influenced by gravitational interaction, but also by magnetic interaction. Earth in Upheaval, New York, 1955, Forum Address, page 297. Radio astronomer James Warwick calculated the influence of two magnetic stars, each of 10,000 Gauss, separated by 3 solar radii and aligned with their dipole moments directed toward each other to maximize the magnetic interaction. Based on his careful calculation, he could claim that the magnetic interaction between the magnetic stars was about 1 billion times smaller than gravity, far too small to influence the orbits of these bodies. We wish to challenge this conclusion based on mathematics and physics and offer observed evidence that denies the validity of Dr. Warwick's calculation and conclusion. Magnetic stars fall into 2 classes. The first type of magnetic star is called an AP star. Jean-Louis Tassel, in his Theory of Rotating Stars, Princeton, New Jersey, 1978, page 430, informs us that almost all high-intensity magnetic fields known in non-degenerate stars are found in the peculiar A-type AP stars. Therefore, these stars are on the main sequence of stars with the largest magnetic fields. The other class of magnetic stars are the AM stars, which, if they have magnetic fields, they are not nearly as powerful as the AP stars with the strongest fields. What is quite unique is that the magnetic axes are a great angle with rotational axis, and thus the magnetic poles are observed to be close to the equator. When stars are in close binaries, tidal forces drive the 2 stars into a position in which their rotational axes move toward parallelism. Thus, the point where very close companions would be in orbit around a magnetic star is at the rotational equator, wherein AP magnetic stars the gravitational forces will be in competition with the dipole moment's magnetic forces in order to form a close binary system, like that proposed by Warwick. There is also another phenomenon observed with magnetic stars. The distribution of the obliquity angles of the magnetic axis appear to be random, but becomes increasingly bimodal as evolution proceeds. Therefore, as the star ages, the magnetic axis will move to align itself with the rotational axis. The magnetic axis of stars with the strongest magnetic fields will, based on this data, be found nearer to the rotational equator. Thus, any star that forms a binary that is close to these magnetic stars, especially those with the strongest magnetic fields, namely the AP type, must do so against at least one of the magnetic dipole moments. It is well observed that both types of magnetic stars, AP and AM, form binary systems. But there is a significant difference that appears to deny Dr. Warwick's views that electromagnetism is an inconsequential force in these star systems. Spectroscopic binary systems are double stars that are so close together that they can only be distinguished by spectroscopic analysis. Nearly all main sequence stars can and do form spectroscopic binary systems. Based on Dr. Warwick's calculation, there is absolutely no reason for the highly magnetic AP stars not to be members of such spectroscopic systems. The fact of the matter is that AP stars are rarely found to have spectroscopic binary companions, and never, so far as I have been able to find, with another AP companion. And we are specifically told that AP stars are generally slow rotators, but they differ from AM stars in being single rather than spectroscopic binaries. The Fact on File, Dictionary of Astronomy, 2nd edition, Illingworth, New York, 1985, page 22. Since all other main sequence stars have such binaries, one astronomer remarked, there seems to be a severe shortage of such spectroscopic binaries among AP stars. While M. Fouquet, in Lestolier's AP Binaries in Astronomy and Astrophysics Abstracts, Volume 30, Part 1, 1983, page 439, has come to the conclusion that the magnetic field seems to play an important role in the relation between binary and AP phenomena. That is, gravitation being about 1 billion times more influential than magnetism, or even several millions of times more so, does not explain why these highly magnetic stars seem to be singular rather than, in rare cases, form spectroscopic binary systems. But what of the extremely weak magnetic AM stars? Interesting. We are informed that they are almost all short-period spectroscopic binaries. Clearly, the only force that distinguishes AP stars from AM stars is the strength of their magnetic poles, and perhaps the inclinations of their magnetic axis to the rotational axis. There is no other principle that coherently explains the fact that AP stars with high magnetic fields are overwhelmingly single and rarely spectroscopic binaries is, as Velikovsky suggested, an electromagnetic repulsion that is too strong to overcome by gravity at close distance. The only force which coherently explains the fact that AM stars with weak or tiny magnetic fields are, by and large, almost all spectroscopic or very close binary systems is an electromagnetic repulsion that is too weak and thus allows companions to move close to them. In addition, we were informed above that all magnetic stars are slow rotators, unlike the same size stars, without their magnetic axis skewered toward their equators. This is clearly a direct indication that the inclination of the magnetic axis pushed through the galactic magnetic field are slowed. But Warwick, in both cases, never answered nor mentioned any of these phenomena, which directly undercut and contradicted his calculations. But it is even remotely possible that Warwick, an authority on magnetic stars, was ignorant of binary behavior of AP and AM stars, and of the fact that they were all slow rotators. When he presented his challenge to Velikovsky and researchers, of course, he had to have known about all these elements. But in all the years that this response to his critique was presented, he never presented or even acknowledged the answer to his criticism existed. He merely presented mathematical equations as proof, but withheld from his readers the actually observed behavioral characteristics of magnetic stars that were in direct contradiction to that math. As with Menzel, when confronted by the evidence, Warwick failed to carry out his scientifically and scholarly duty and left his erroneous criticism in the literature.
What we're really saying is An electric current must exist somewhere in the neighborhood of a magnetic field, every magnetic field.
The third instance of the early Velikovsky affair, wherein a critic attacked Velikovsky's concept that there was an electromagnetic force in addition to gravity operating, is Ivan King, an astronomer and one of the organizers of the 1974 AAAS Symposium on Velikovsky, who bluntly stated before the meeting was even held, "What disturbs the scientist is the persistence of these views, in spite of all the efforts that scientists have spent educating the public. It is in this context that the AAAS undertakes the Velikovsky Symposium. Although the symposium necessarily includes a presentation of opposing views, we do not consider this to be the primary purpose of the symposium. None of us in the scientific establishment believes that a debate about Velikovsky's astronomical electromagnetic force views would be remotely justified at a serious scientific meeting." Strangely enough, King's research deals with the behavior of globular clusters that are spherical in shape and are made up of 10,000 to 1 million mostly old red giant stars. There are a few hundred globular clusters in the Milky Way, with the greatest concentration of stars toward their central cores. Also unusual is that these globular clusters do not revolve about the galaxy as do the stars in the galactic disk on relatively circular orbits. Rather, these clusters have orbits that are highly elliptical, like those of most comets in the solar system. Globular clusters orbit toward and away around the galactic core. Furthermore, the orbits of the stars in these globular clusters do not orbit its core in circular orbits, but do so in orbits that are highly elliptical. This creates a major gravitational problem in explaining how these clusters can survive. Over time, stars will approach one another and gravitational interactions will accelerate one of them so greatly that it will leave the cluster forever. Therefore, these globular clusters should be shedding members and becoming ever smaller in size. However, when a star is kicked out of the cluster, it will remove gravitational energy or angular momentum with it and make up for this loss of gravitational energy. The star that interacted with the escaped one must move inward to counterbalance that loss. The law of conservation of angular momentum is fundamental to gravitational theory and demands this. Therefore, because the globular cluster is now somewhat smaller in size, the stars in it left behind will move closer to one another and will then repeat the interaction process again and again, sending stars out of the cluster while the cluster continues to contract. But, for some reason, this law of gravity is not working in these globular systems. King well understood this fundamental contradiction to gravitational theory and admitted this. Now, this not only relates to the hundreds of globular clusters in the Milky Way, but to the billions upon billions of other spiral galaxies with globular clusters throughout the universe. In other words, celestial mechanic equations cannot account for the failure of these fundamental laws to work as they should throughout the universe. Here, then, is how King dealt with this massive negation of the theory he claims disproves Velikovsky. Although globular clusters are obviously long-lived, they are not immutable. Slowly but steadily, stars evaporate, escape from the cluster as they reach escape velocity from the cluster during their interactions. A gravitational theory that adequately predicts the resulting evolution of the cluster is basically simple, but many of the details have remained elusive. The binding energy of a cluster holding it together is really an energy deficit, the energy it would take to accelerate all the stars to their escape velocity and tear the cluster apart. To reach escape velocity, a star must acquire enough kinetic stars that escape are those with the most kinetic energy, whereas the amount of gravitational energy they contribute to the cluster is no more than average. As a result, the evaporation of stars increases the amount of binding energy per star remaining in the cluster as the cluster contracts. According to the current theory, it does not reach a steady state. Instead, energy from the contraction of the cluster is converted into kinetic energy of stellar motion, thereby heating the core. The core becomes more dense, and the stars in it near it remove more rapidly. Therefore, more stars evaporate, and the core continues to contract and heat without bound until it is infinitely dense. Donald Lyndon Bell, proponent of the theory, has dubbed this positive feedback phenomenon of the gravitational catastrophe. When the theory was first put forward in 1960 by Michael Hennon of the Nice Observatory, there was little observational evidence to support it. Only the globular cluster M15 shows any sign of the sharp density peak one would expect in a collapsed core. Recently, however, my colleague Stanislaw Georgiewiski and I have been making more careful observations of a large number of globular clusters. We have observed at least a half a dozen displaying density peaks we believe to be an evidence of core collapse. Still, a half a dozen is not many. Gravitational theories of cluster evolution predict that a much larger fraction of the ancient globular clusters in the Milky Way should have collapsed by now. The various analytical and numerical models also concur in predicting that once the core collapse begins, it proceeds so rapidly one would be unlikely to observe it in progress. Why have more central density peaks not been detected? One possibility is that the predicted timescales for core collapse are too short. A more likely explanation is that some mechanism halts the collapse and even causes the core to re-expand back to normal. In other words, King is directly saying that something else must be happening in the globular cluster, that is, acting against gravity to keep it from collapsing. That is, as the cluster begins to develop a smaller core, something else comes into play and offsets the collapse, and then actually re-expands or pushes the cluster back to its normal size. He had completely overlooked that this specifically would be explained by Velikovsky, who maintained that the charged celestial bodies, when close to one another, would be cushioned by their repelling magnetic fields. Yet, here again, we have Ivan King offering some sort of mechanism at close quarters is able to overwhelm gravity. William R. Corliss understood the dilemma that underlay the gravitational processes in globular clusters and kept them from collapsing as they shed stars into space, and calls the mechanism just what it is, a force. Some unidentified force at the cores of the cluster may be operative. What force outside of gravity is known to exist in space except electromagnetism? But King would gouge his eyes out rather than suggest Velikovsky might be right. All sorts of ideas have been invoked to fill this gaping hole in gravitational theory. For example, one is that as the core collapses, many close binary stars will then form an offset to single stars that can interact, but only information for this is an interpretation of X-ray sources at the cores of these clusters. But this explanation only applies to some globular clusters. If the theory was correct, it would apply to nearly all of them. Other scientists have even suggested that an undiscovered form of matter called dark matter somehow halts the collapse, though this highly speculative idea is not accepted. Theory has been piled on theory in an attempt to salvage the globular cluster contradiction for gravitation theory. Earlier, it was suggested that these clusters are rotating, which would clearly resolve the problem, since the stars would be in more circular orbits and rarely interact. But as Dewey Larson pithily explained, showing that some clusters rotate is meaningless. All must be rotating quite rapidly to give any substance to the hypothesis that rotational forces counterbalance the gravitational attraction. If even one cluster is not rotating, or is rotating slowly, this is sufficient to demonstrate that rotation is not the answer to the problem. Only Velikovsky's theory that charged celestial bodies would exhibit a cushioning effect at close range explains the behavior of globular clusters throughout the universe. King, of course, could never consider this because it would mean Velikovsky could be right. In every case, in the early Velikovsky affair, the arguments raised to dispute that electromagnetic effects play no role in celestial mechanics have been answered. At no time did Velikovsky's critics ever acknowledge that their attacks were answered in Velikovskyan or other literature, nor did they ever respond to the answers and evidence provided by Velikovsky or proponents of his ideas. They failed to act in all cases to act in a scholarly, scientific, or rational manner, and eluded their duty by simple denial of these realities they could not explain away nor prove were invalid. Before going on, it must also be reported, as did Colin Wilson, his electromagnetic theory led Velikovsky to predict that Jupiter would be found to emit radio waves, and that the Sun would have an extremely powerful magnetic field. It could be said that many of Velikovsky's theories including the idea that Jupiter and the Sun have large magnetospheres, are now accepted as part of astrophysics, except, of course, no one acknowledges that Velikovsky was the first one to formulate them. So too, the electromagnetic evidence below to be presented is unacknowledged by the scientific community. Interesting. The next one coming up is the experimental evidence. It's very interesting that these esteemed astronomers just can't find it in themselves to give Velikovsky one bit of credit, but they want everyone to believe in dark forces and black holes. It's amazing. Thanks for listening. Some unidentified force.
It boggles their imagination. Pygmy Bush baby. He understands. I don't know if Brandy's still out there, but I found something that specifically suits you. Being a Scorpio, I just have to find it.
Bro.
And to say they have a reputation for being difficult to relax around is probably. Scorpio is a fixed water sign. And to say they have a reputation for being difficult to relax around is probably an understatement. Often described as intense, penetrating, brooding, even volcanic, they sound like something best left alone. To quietly lurk in the dark, hard to reach places, and there is a certain truth that unnecessarily agitating a scorpion who's within deadly striking distance is a very bad idea. But as a water sign, Scorpios view themselves as sensitive souls, who are commonly misunderstood by others. Scorpios don't want to reveal what they're feeling in any simple, forthright manner, seemingly generating a smoldering intensity that warns others to back off. Don't dare get too close. The way Scorpio keeps its power-packed emotions under lock and key is enough to make anyone feel suspicious and uneasy. Scorpio can be fixated in its focus and unable, at times, to just go with the flow. The Scorpion, almost as a reaction to Libra's friendly openness, realizes that while intimacy can heal, it can hurt as well, and exposing our psychological innards to another involves utmost trust. Agree there. Such exposure of themselves, especially if they don't use good judgment regarding the partners they pick, can result in criticism, ridicule, abandonment, or worse, betrayal. Oh, I sympathize. I empathize. Emotional vulnerability is a characteristic of all water signs. Yes, but I think that they can be more flipped than anyone else too. But Scorpio hates the fact and will do whatever it takes to hide such hypersensitivity, equating vulnerability with weakness. The Scorpion can be riddled with deep insecurity, the kind that makes its world appear untrustworthy. But if you try to deliberately humiliate a Scorpio, then watch out for signs of barely contained rage. For Scorpio's fury may be felt even before a sense of shame sets in, if it does at all. A Scorpio will not allow itself toyed with, scolded, or even threatened in demeaning ways. Leo may
indulge in its dramatic royal pout when its pride has been wounded. But Scorpio aims for the jugular, at least on those psychological levels where it knows it can do more permanent damage. A Scorpio isn't sure if it can ever play nice again, once violated by another. But where such intensity of rage and fury can be found, one also finds deeply passionate feelings in Scorpio. Passion is even more intensified because it is often restrained or suppressed in deliberately holding something back. Often, only when it does finally come out, the Scorpion's passion can become too strong and uncontrollable a force. In Scorpio, the resourcefulness of fixity and the emotionality of water are combined with the invisible power of Pluto to create a nature of profound depth and dramatic intensity. The Scorpio, a great deal is going on under the surface. Energy is being held in reserve. Water stands for emotion, and emotion can be fixed only if it is not expressed, which only increases its intensity. The symbol for Scorpio, the scorpion, is a creature that travels by night and is feared for its deadly sting. This does not mean all Scorpio people are venomous and cruel, but the symbol does convey the qualities of secretiveness, penetration, and power that do characterize the natives of this sign. But the ancient esoteric symbols for Scorpio was the eagle, one of the biblical four beasts of the apocalypse, who represent the four fixed signs of the zodiac. The eagle kills too, but it also soars high above the ground, and thus symbolizes not only power, but transcendence. Pluto, the modern ruler of Scorpio, was a Roman god of the underworld, associating the sign of Scorpio with death. It is also a sign of birth and sexuality. In short, critical moments of human existence that involve a release of the ego and contact with the ultimate mysteries. Scorpio people have an awareness of death that is often not fearful, for this is also the sign of reincarnation. They have a natural affinity for occult studies. The occult means hidden. And like the Scorpions, the only thing Scorpio is afraid of is being known as deeply as they wish to know. Such an ability to penetrate and probe can be channeled constructively into researching or healing. But it can also be used to manipulate people in personal relationships. But they excel in any activity that involves going deeply into things, such as psychology, detective work, investigation, and research in all of the sciences, as well as hypnotism and all forms of healing. The last age of Scorpio, 16,759 to 14,773 BCE, or 8,600 to 10,800 CE, began as the last great ice age was slowly coming to an end. Okay. This present ice age began, according to current theory, 40 million years ago. I highly doubt that. And was the last of the intensified, the last of perhaps 4 major ice ages in the history of the planet Earth, The present ice age intensified during the Pleistocene period. There were a couple of modern archaeologists in the 90s. One of them was named Delaird. I'm trying to think of the book that they wrote, and the science was in. In just that one book, I crushed all kinds of glacier theory, the fact that there were ice above the mountains. They defeated that. And I know one guy's name was Delaird. I'm going to have to find out the name of the other guy and the name of the book. It was something about the day the Earth almost died or something like that. But there was something very important there that they debunked. And also,
I
the
haven't
biggest
listened
signs
to
of
this
cataclysm were
in
on
a
the
long
North
time.
Pole
I
to
could say
polar
anything.
displacement.
I'm
I'll
scared.
get back to reading. It was the last, perhaps, of the 4 major ice ages in the history of the planet Earth. The present ice age intensified during the Pleistocene period some 3 million years ago, with glaciers spreading in the northern hemisphere. Since that time, the Earth has seen cycles of advancing and retreating glaciation on 40,000 and 100,000 year timescales. Now they make you sound like they're so sure. That is a complete guess. With the last cycle ending just about 10,000 years ago during the Age of Leo, it is against this backdrop of ice, glaciation, that human beings first appeared. The early ancestor of modern humans, called Homo habilis, developed the earliest known stone tools. These were relatively simple tools, known as choppers. Homo habilis is presumed to have mastered the Oldowan era tool case, which sustained on scavenged meat and wild plants, rather than hunted prey. Around 1.5 million years ago, a more evolved human species, Homo erectus, appeared, learning to control fire and creating more complex chopper tools, as well as expanding out of Africa to reach Asia. Out of Africa theory has already been disproven. But anyways, as shown by sites such as mainstream likes to cling to their paradigms, even when they've been disproved.
Zirconian.
Zirconian in China. By 1 million years ago, earliest evidence of humans in Europe is known, as well as use of the more advanced hand axe tool. Homo sapiens, humans being, most direct ancestor appeared somewhere between 400,000 and 250,000 years ago. Oh, come on. Remember where I was now. Relatively suddenly beginning. However, little had really changed in terms of their lifestyle. From their earliest predecessors until relatively suddenly, beginning at about 40,000 years ago, they began to produce regionally distinctive cultures using new technologies. Just like bang. More efficient hunting. Well, look what happened to us in the last 150 years. Techniques. And having a more rarefied aesthetic sensibility, refined aesthetic sensibility. The Upper Paleolithic period, a flowering of the Paleolithic period, saw an astonishing number of human cultures, such as the
Aurignacian.
Aurignacian, never heard of those before, have you? Gravitation?
Gravitian.
Gravitian?
Perigordian.
Perigordian? I know that's Salutrian.
Salutrian.
And Magdalenian?
Demagdalenian.
Magdalenian. Rise and develop in the Old World. The beginnings of communal hunting and extensive fishing are found here, as is the first conclusive evidence of belief systems centering on magic and the supernatural. Been with us a long time. Pit houses, the first man-made shelters, were built. Sewn clothing was worn, and sculpture and painting originated. Tools were of great variety. I'm sure they were great worth, too, including flint and obsidian blades and projectile points. It is probable that the people of the Aurignacian culture migrated to Europe after developing their distinctive culture elsewhere, perhaps in Asia. Their stone Their stone tools are finely worked, and they made a typical figure 8 shaped blade. They also used bone, horn, and ivory, and made necklaces and other personal ornaments. They carved the so-called Venus figures, ritual statuettes of bone, and made outline drawings on cave walls. Middle Paleolithic peoples demonstrate the earliest evidence for art and other expressions of abstract thought, such as ochre body decoration. Oh, they could make some beautiful pieces, too. And you don't know how they get them. The thread between a hole that's microscopic, it's ridiculous. I've seen some of it. Or something like how they could make such a tiny hole in such a thin fleck of stone or shell without breaking it. Petroglyphs appeared in the New Stone Age, commonly known as Neolithic period. A petroglyph is an abstract or symbolic image recorded on stone, usually by prehistoric peoples by means of carving. Yeah, and add of what they saw in the sky. Symbols used in communication. Petroglyphs have been discovered in different parts of the world, including Asia, India, North America, Death Valley National Park, South America, Peru, Europe, Norway. Rock paintings were painted on rock and were more naturalistic depictions than petroglyphs. Yeah, things they saw in the sky. Plasma displacement. In Paleolithic times, the representation of humans in cave paintings was rare. Mostly animals were painted. Oh, man. I lost my... Oh, yeah. Not only animals that were used as food, but also animals that represented strength like the rhinoceros or large cats, as in the Chevet Cave. Signs like dots were sometimes drawn. Rare human representations include handprints and half-human, half-animal figures. The cave of Chevet, I'm pretty sure the T is silent. And my French is just absolutely horrible.
Ardèche.
In the Ardèche department. France contains the most important preserved cave paintings of the Paleolithic era. France contains the most important preserved cave paintings of the Paleolithic era, painted around 31,000 BC. The Hall of Bulls in Lascaux. Oh my goodness, what is this?
So I suspect... Nassau, Dordogne.
Lascaux, Dordogne. France. Lascaux, Dordogne, France, is one of the best-known cave paintings from about 15,000 to 10,000 BC. The meaning of the paintings remains unknown. The caves were not in an inhabited area, so they may have been used for seasonal rituals. The animals are accompanied by signs which suggest a possible magic use. Arrow-like symbols in Lascaux are sometimes interpreted as calendar or almanac use, but the evidence remains inconclusive. Modern studies and the in-depth analysis of finds dating from the Stone Age indicate certain rituals and beliefs of people in those prehistoric times, and it is now believed that activities of the Stone Age humans went beyond the immediate requirements of procuring food, body coverings, and shelters. Specific rites relating to death and burial were practiced, though certainly differing in style and execution between cultures. Several Stone Age dated sites in different parts of the world indicate traces of dancing in files, and initiation rites near the end of the last ice age, 15,000 to 9,000 years ago, on large-scale extinction of large mammals, known as the first Holocene extinction event. This event possibly forced modification in the dietary habits of the humans of that age, and with the emergence of agricultural practices, plant-based foods also became a regular part of the diet. You know, I think when going back up here, where does it say? Specific rites were practiced, death and burial, practicing ritual style, execution, different parts of the... I had a thought I wanted to... Modern studies, in-depth dating, Stone Age, indicate. How did they know they were dancing? How could they tell? Did they find a little part of a floor that was worn out or something? I mean, how... Yeah, they probably were, but how could you ever see evidence of dancing? Unless they danced in the mud and it hardened or something like that. That's kind of ridiculous. No. Let's see, what else? The scorpion bears something. The horizontal dashed line near the cross, the center is the ecliptic. The broad dark band at the top is centered on the ecliptic and shows the region in which claws in Bayer's time were taken as Zex Scorpii and Sigma Scorpii, the latter now part of Libra, and that is it.
No, not quite. There's a little bit more I want to read on Scorpio, and then I'll say goodnight. Scorpio zodiac sign traits: passionate, independent, and unafraid to blaze their own trail no matter what others think. Scorpio signs make a statement wherever they go. They love debates, aren't afraid of controversy, and won't back down from a debate. They also hate people who aren't genuine and are all about being authentic, even if authentic isn't pretty. Because of all of these traits, a Scorpio can seem intimidating and somewhat closed off to those who don't know them well. But what people don't realize is that even though Scorpio may seem brusque. It changed on me. You little bugger. Why'd you do that? I'm almost done, too. Because they want to sell you something, man. That's why. All right, where was I? I lost my place. This leads to Scorpio's central conflict. Their feelings are what drives them and strengthens them, but their immutability can scare them and make them feel vulnerable and out of control. Because of this conflict, Scorpios, like their namesake, the scorpion, put up an outer shell and seem prickly. But once people get beyond the shell, they find a loyal, loving person whose passion knows no bounds. Sounds interesting. Scorpio dives into all life, has to offer with 110% enthusiasm. A Scorpio will be your most loyal friend, most dedicated employee, and your worst enemy, if they want to be. In love, Scorpio can seem cautious at first, and may seem to set up a series of tests for their potential partner, deciding to cross them off their list if they don't meet their demands. The trouble is, they tend to keep their partner out of the loop on what exactly they want. Well, that's good. Making their partner feel like they have to play mind reader. If a Scorpio and their partner can get past this initial hurdle, the connection will be intense in both highs and lows. A Scorpio will love harder and fight harder than any other sign, and wants their partner to be absolutely honest. They will be, even if it's not what the partner wants to hear. In the bedroom, Scorpio is generous, imaginative, and always up for anything. all night long. Scorpio. That was for Brandy. I remember she shouted it out once, and I did it for you. That will do it for me. Let me get you, say hello to you before I go. I got to get my son up for school. And I just wanted to play that one Saturn theory thing from Thornhill. I thought it was really good. And the boys, you know. All right, I got you here. Let me just get you on TV. There you are. All right, who do we got tonight? Or this morning, I should say. Buried X-Blade, of course. And Jasper, well, it's for you too, Jasper. It's for all the Scorpios. Ricky, I'm a Sag too, Rick. I already read Sag. Did you ever see it? It's pretty good. It was the first one. Knowledge. Thomas McGruber. Ricky Spence. Knowledge. Buried Axeblade. Thomas McGruber. And I thought I saw Grouch here, but he's gone now. The Zingster. And I'm going up, going up, going up. It looks like you got Vados Lagos was here. Randy Garcia was here. Good to see you all. It's always good to see everybody. As Keith Richards once said, hell, it's good to be anywhere. And Bad to the Bone, 85. Like that song. I love that song, actually. Well, guys, I got to go. I'll leave you with something, though. I don't want to leave you cold. I'll play something. I got about 20 more minutes before I got to get them up. And then we got to get on off to school. So it will be brief. Let me just find it here. It's going to have to be a shorty. I think I know what it might be. Let me see here. Put this on for a second. I'll be right back.
It was Velikovsky's claim that only a few thousand years ago, a period of chaos reigned in the solar system. One of the planets closely associated with Earth was Saturn, and watery filaments rained on our planet following Saturn's violent flare-up. Decades later, based on the respective research of Dave Talbot and Eduardo Cardona, Thornhill developed his own model of a primordially close relationship between Earth and Saturn, which was the source of all the water in our oceans, while leaving remnants